On a cool October afternoon in the early 1960s, the small river town of Bristol, Pennsylvania, felt unchanged from the rhythms it had always known. Rows of tidy homes, the sound of bicycles skipping over pavement seams, the sense shared quietly by families that their children could explore without fear, drifting freely between school, church, and neighborhood sidewalks. Among these children was Carol Anne Dougherty, a little girl remembered by everyone who knew her as gentle, bright, and full of innocent enthusiasm. She was 9 years old, but already carried herself with the lively curiosity of a child who wanted to understand the world. She loved stories, mysteries, and the simple thrill of turning a page to find out what happened next. Books were her companions. Her bicycle, blue, white, and chrome, was the vessel that carried her to them. She had received that bicycle on Christmas Day of the previous year, a gift delivered with festive excitement and the warmth of family tradition. Christmas had fallen just one day after her birthday. The bike was new, sturdy, and gleaming. A Londoner racing bicycle that felt, to her, like freedom on two wheels. In a town where children played outside until dinner bells rang, that bike took her everywhere she wanted to go. On the morning of October 22, 1962, nothing seemed unusual. Carol arrived home from school as she always did. She slipped out of her uniform. She planned her short trip to the Bristol Borough Free Library only a few minutes away by bicycle. She had 2 books to return, and she was eager to check out the next installment in her favorite mystery series. Before meeting her friends at the library, she decided she had time for one stop, Tommy's Market, where she could buy a Coca-Cola and a few pieces of penny candy. It was a ritual, a small joy, the kind that defines childhood. Around 4 o'clock that afternoon, she rode off, her bike wheels humming beneath the autumn sky. She never made it home for dinner. Instead origined in mating the South too. At the Dougherty home, dinner was always served at 4:45, a tradition set not out of rigidity, but routine. It was simply how the family operated, how their days kept rhythm. When Carol failed to return on time, concern sprouted quickly, quietly, but firmly. Frank and Dorothy Dougherty began searching the neighborhood. They checked the sidewalks. They checked the library. They checked the familiar paths a 9-year-old girl would naturally take. It did not take long for Dorothy to find Carol's bicycle. It was parked neatly outside St. Mark's Catholic Church, the family's parish, the same church connected to the school she attended. Her daughter's bike sat untouched. Carol was nowhere to be seen. Dorothy searched inside the church first, calling her daughter's name softly, hoping perhaps Carol had simply paused to pray. The nuns often encouraged the children to stop inside on their way home. It was a safe place, a familiar place. But Dorothy found nothing. She returned. She looked again. She walked farther. She came back a second time. Still nothing. Minutes felt like hours. Frank arrived at the church shortly after 5:25. He, too, searched silently through the sanctuary, calling his daughter's name in a hushed voice that echoed up toward the choir loft. And then, beneath a stained glass window in the vestibule of the choir loft, he found her. The moment shattered the Dougherty family forever. Neighbors would later recall hearing a sound, a cry that did not resemble any human expression they had ever heard before. A sound that decades later would still haunt the one who heard it most clearly. Carol's little sister, Kay, who was not yet 3 years old at the time. The Doughertys' lives split into a before and an after, and the town of Bristol changed with them. That night, many families locked their doors for the first time. Very too. By evening, Bristol police had launched one of the largest investigations the town had ever seen. Officers combed through the church, the surrounding streets, the yards, the back alleys, and the riverbank. Word spread quickly through the community. Residents began calling in tips with anything and everything they thought might help. Several suspects emerged almost immediately. A teenage boy's parents contacted police, worried because they found Carol's name written in one of his notebooks. Someone else reported seeing him with scratches on his face on the day of the murder. It seemed promising until investigators learned he had been in Virginia the entire day, taking a driving test. He had a dated, time-stamped receipt proving it. Another suspect, a local handyman named Frank Zucchero, had been seen stumbling past the church, intoxicated, around the time Carol was attacked. He was known around town as a heavy drinker. His behavior often made him the subject of rumors. Police questioned him aggressively, too aggressively. Zukuro eventually confessed, but the confession collapsed. A Bristol officer later admitted he had pressured Zukuro into falsely claiming responsibility. Zukuro's alibi was later verified, and he was released. The search continued. Police began questioning the priests assigned to Streetmark's church. Every one of them, all but one, had verifiable alibis. The one exception was Father Joseph Sabates. The priest told investigators he had been visiting parishioners at the time of the murder. But when police spoke to the families he named, each one said he had not visited them that day. Witnesses placed him near the church, minutes after the estimated time of Carol's death, acting strangely. Other concerns surfaced. The owner of a women's lingerie shop identified Sabates as a regular customer. He told her the items were for his wife, though priests did not have wives. Bristol police soon discovered he had previously harassed a woman at another parish, calling her home to make lewd comments, threats, and unwanted advances. Her husband recorded one of the calls and turned the tape over to investigators. What had begun as an innocent inquiry into priestly whereabouts now spiraled into a political and religious firestorm. When police tried to question Sabates again, Monsignor Paul Baird, the pastor at Streetmarks, intervened angrily. He confronted Police Chief Vincent Ferragalli in public, shouting accusations of anti-Catholic persecution. But Chief Ferragalli shouted back, "I'm a cop trying to figure out who killed that little girl in your church." Tension spread quickly between police and clergy, between townspeople and leadership, and between those demanding accountability and those terrified of scandal. Still, the questions persisted. Why had a little girl been killed inside her own church? And who had managed to slip away undetected? Tiverfrance? Months went by, with no arrest. Then, in January of the following year, 1963, a witness reported seeing a suspicious man with a distinctive facial scar outside Streetmarks on the day of the murder. His name was William Shrader. He had a violent past that stretched back to childhood. From the time he was 8, he had harmed other children. He spent time in reform schools. He entered the Army at 17 and was dishonorably discharged within a year. Afterward, he shot at a man. He was convicted of attempted murder and imprisoned at Eastern State Penitentiary. By the early 1960s, Shrader had relocated to Bristol, staying in transient housing and living just 1 block from Streetmark's Catholic Church. He denied everything when questioned. His initial alibi? He claimed he was at work until 4:30 on the day of the murder. When police checked with his employer, they discovered the truth. He had clocked out at 1:58 in the afternoon and never returned for several days. Confronted with the discrepancy, Shrader changed his story, claiming he had been fixing a motor at a junkyard. The junkyard owner could not confirm it. His whereabouts were unaccounted for. The suspicion was growing. Shrader agreed to provide a hair sample. He agreed to a polygraph examination. He passed the polygraph and was released. And for the next several decades, the case remained cold. Tiverfrance? Carol's parents never recovered. Her mother, Dorothy, retreated into grief and passed away in the mid-1970s. Her father, Frank, lived into the early 2000s, but never saw the case solved. He said, shortly before his death, that his last hope was to learn who had taken his daughter's life. Chief Ferragalli, too, remained haunted. Even after retiring, he kept Carol's photograph on his desk and later in his home. He considered it the most devastating case he ever worked. Investigators revisited the case periodically. Technology advanced, forensic science changed, but the case remained untouched by the breakthroughs that were revolutionizing other cold cases. The evidence had been stored in an attic exposed to heat, cold, and time. Attempts at DNA profiling in the 1990s failed. Still, the belief that Shrader was involved persisted quietly among those who had worked the case longest. But without proof, the case could not move. Until more than 6 decades later. As the 1960s slipped into the 1970s, Carol Anne Dougherty's case remained open but stagnant. Bristol police refused to close it. They refused to call it hopeless. They refused to admit defeat, even as the years marched forward and the world around Bristol changed. But the suspect who stayed in the shadows, always close, always chillingly plausible, was the one who had been violent long before Carol's murder and would continue to be violent long after. William Shrader. His life was a trail of destruction. Even as investigators lost immediate leads, Shrader was living out a pattern of cruelty that echoed the same darkness that had consumed Carol's final moments. He was a drifter, a man who learned early that fear could be a weapon, and who used that weapon on anyone susceptible to his presence. In the years after Carol's death, he fled Pennsylvania. He surfaced in Florida, then drifted to Louisiana, leaving behind a sequence of crimes that grew progressively more disturbing. Arrest records, police reports, and witness interviews built the picture of a man whose violence had not been the product of a single moment but a lifelong trajectory. By the late 1960s, Shrader had settled in Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana, a place remote enough for a man to disappear into, yet close enough to society for him to exploit its most vulnerable people. There, he met a woman through her adult son who had served time in the same correctional facility as Shrader. The relationship developed into a marriage, one that would become the center of an even darker chapter. Because she had 2 daughters, both of them with special needs. Both of them easy prey for a man like Shrader. What happened inside that home in Louisiana would later become part of the reason investigators believed he was capable of the senseless destruction inflicted on Carol Anne. And the details, though we will present them with sensitivity, are essential to understanding how the past finally caught up with him. Shrader began abusing both stepdaughters not long after marrying into the family. His cruelty escalated slowly, deliberately, with the kind of manipulation found among the most dangerous offenders. He impregnated one of the girls, fathering a child as a result of the abuse. When that child, his own biological daughter, reached the age of 8, he began abusing her as well. Through a mixture of manipulation, intimidation, and physical threats, he kept the household silent. He targeted those with the least ability to defend themselves. And as the years passed, it became clear that Shrader did not view human lives as anything more than tools to satisfy his impulses. But he wanted more, and he found ways to get more. Shrader's wife adopted a 2-year-old girl. Later, they allowed one of their neighbors, a 12-year-old girl named Catherine Smith, to move into their home as a foster child. Catherine was kind, soft-spoken, and trusting. She was the kind of child who assumed adults were safe. Shrader targeted her immediately. And it was Catherine, not the adults in the home, who would one day confront danger with more courage than anyone expected. Her bravery would save a life. And cost her own. I do, Mayor. The night of the tragedy was Halloween, 1978 years after Carol Anne was killed. Shrader and his wife argued violently, their voices carrying through the modest Louisiana home. At some point during the argument, Shrader physically attacked his wife. Her adult son, Shrader's stepson, intervened, ordering Shrader out of the house. Shrader left, but not before making a threat that would echo through the decades. He told his family, "I'm coming back, and I'm going to burn the house down and kill everyone inside." Hours later, flames consumed the home. Firefighters rushed to the scene. Adults managed to escape, but inside the house were 3 children. Shrader's biological daughter, the 2-year-old adopted girl, and Catherine Smith. Catherine, recognizing the danger, shielded the toddler's body with her own, pressing the smaller child beneath her as the smoke thickened around them. She refused to abandon her. She chose to protect her, even as the fire took her life. The toddler survived because Catherine, only 12 years old, chose to be a barrier. When firefighters found the 2-year-old alive beneath her body, the reality became clear. Catherine Smith had died saving a child from a man who had already caused so much suffering. The fire became the center of an investigation. But with limited witness cooperation and the complexities of Louisiana's legal system at the time, Shrader was not immediately charged. Fear silenced people. Shame silenced others. And Shrader, as he had done in Pennsylvania, escaped accountability again. For 15 years. Then, in 1985, witnesses finally came forward. Shrader was arrested, charged, and convicted of arson and manslaughter for the death of 12-year-old Catherine Smith. He was sentenced to 21 years in prison. He would eventually die behind bars in the early 2000s, never knowing that, long after his death, a grand jury would conclude what investigators had suspected for more than half a century. that he had killed Carol Anne Dougherty. But before that final conclusion came, investigators had to rebuild the case piece by piece. And they had to contend with something that no one had expected: a confession. In November of 2024, more than 60 years after Carol's death, investigators in Bristol received information that would shake the case open again. A witness had come forward. A witness who should have been interviewed decades earlier. His name was Robert LeBlanc, Schrader's stepson. He told police that Shrader had confessed to him not once but twice that he had raped and killed a little girl in Pennsylvania. He described how Shrader lured her into a church, how he took advantage of her small size and vulnerability, how he strangled her because, in his words, she would have talked. Robert kept these memories buried for decades. He had tried to report them once in 1994 and again in 2007, but the information never made it, from Louisiana authorities to Pennsylvania investigators. A bureaucratic failure. A communication gap that cost years. But Robert remembered the details. Details he could not have invented. Details he had no way of knowing unless Shrader had told him firsthand. Investigators traveled to Louisiana to interview him in person. They left convinced Shrader's confession was real. The timeline fit. The behavior fit. His pattern of violence fit. And psychologically, the motives matched. Still, investigators needed more than a confession spoken decades after the crime. They needed physical support. They needed something that tied Shrader more directly to the crime scene. And they had it. It had been sitting in storage for decades. When Carol's body was discovered, investigators collected every piece of potential evidence they could find, even if they did not yet know how it would be used. Among the evidence were pubic hairs clutched in her small hand and found on her leg. In 1962, hair comparison could only provide basic characteristics. By the 1990s, forensic science had evolved. Hair microscopy remained limited, but it allowed detailed comparison. Investigators submitted Shrader's hair sample for analysis. The result was not definitive, but it was significant. Shrader's hair was consistent with the hairs found on Carol's body. No other suspect's hair matched. Not one. Out of 141 samples collected, Shrader's was the only one that could not be excluded. Investigators tried to perform DNA extraction multiple times, hoping modern technology would finally succeed, but the evidence had been exposed to extreme heat and cold in an attic for decades. It had degraded too much. DNA testing failed. Even so, forensic experts testified that the hair analysis excluded every known suspect except Shrader. The circumstantial evidence tightened. The confession added weight. The pattern of violence was unmistakable. The timeline was consistent. And a final review, more than 60 years after the crime, would bring everything together. By the time the 21st century arrived, Carol Anne Dougherty's case was nearly 4 decades old. Many of the original investigators had retired. Some had passed away. Witnesses were fading. Memories were blurring around the edges. And the physical evidence stored in an attic that was never designed to preserve forensic materials had deteriorated from heat, cold, and time. But the case never went cold inside the hearts of those who touched it. Chief Vincent Ferragali had carried the weight of Carol Anne's loss through his entire career. Even after retirement, he kept her photo visible, framed near his desk at home. And when he passed away in the early 2000s, the photograph remained a symbol of a promise he had always hoped to keep: to find her killer. Yet the final break would not come from those who first worked the case. It would come from a new generation armed with the ability to look back over 6 decades with fresh eyes, modern understanding, and the benefit of hindsight. In October of the year 2025, the Bucks County District Attorney's Office convened a special investigating grand jury. These grand juries are made up of everyday citizens, selected randomly, who are sworn to review evidence in unsolved or complex cases. They hear testimony, examine records, and decide whether the evidence supports a particular conclusion. When the grand jury members opened the file on Carol Anne Dougherty, they were looking at 63 years of pain, dozens of suspects, thousands of pages, decades of unanswered questions. What they uncovered was not just a single suspect, but a pattern, one that stretched from Pennsylvania to Louisiana, from Carol's gentle footsteps through the church doorway to the flames that consumed a foster child 8 years later. And that pattern pointed, again and again, to one man, William Shrader. The grand jury spent months reviewing historic witness statements, Schrader's criminal record, psychiatric assessments, polygraph results, forensic hair comparisons, the stepson's confession testimony, sex, investigative notes from the 1960s, 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s, and piece by piece, the puzzle sharpened into a picture investigators had long believed to be true. The evidence was clear, even if incomplete. The only reasonable conclusion was that William Shrader raped and murdered 9-year-old Carol Anne Dougherty on that October afternoon in the year 1962. And in late October of the year 2025, the grand jury released a 53-page report summarizing their findings, making the conclusion official. They had solved the case. At last. One of the pivotal pieces of the grand jury's investigation came from an expert in sex offender psychology, a clinical and forensic specialist with decades of experience in analyzing offenders who target children. The psychologist testified that Schrader's behavior fit a well-understood pattern: escalation over time. Offenders often begin with smaller acts of violence, aggression, or cruelty. Schrader's violence began at 8 years old, when he hit a young girl in the face with a club. Opportunistic victim selection. Children who appear trusting, kind, curious, or independent become targets for offenders seeking vulnerability. Carol Anne, a frequent visitor to the church and the library, fit the profile of a child who would stop to say a prayer, enter the vestibule quietly, and trust that she was safe within a religious space. Blending into community settings. Offenders often position themselves in places where children feel protected: churches, schools, familiar community locations. Street. Mark's Catholic Church was a perfect setting for a predator who lived only a block away and who was known to wander the neighborhood on foot. Violence used to silence. Schrader's alleged confession to his stepson included a chilling detail. He claimed he murdered the little girl because she would have talked. This explanation aligned with the psychologist's assessment and with patterns seen in offenders who escalate from sexual assault to murder to conceal their crimes. Continuation into adulthood. Schrader's decades-long pattern of sexual violence against children, including his stepdaughters, his biological daughter, the adopted toddler, and 12-year-old Catherine, reinforced the psychological profile of an offender with long-standing predatory behavior. The psychologist concluded that Schrader displayed the classic traits of a sexually violent predator with a history of opportunistic child targeting, and that his behavior was fully consistent with the murder of a 9-year-old girl in 1962. This expert testimony gave the grand jury what they needed: a professional affirmation that the pattern was not only consistent, but predictable. Schrader had not changed. He had not snapped. He had simply continued what he had begun in childhood. 1. Even without DNA, the forensic story told through the evidence was powerful. When Carol's body was found, investigators collected every hair, fiber, and trace they could see. Among them were pubic hairs found on her body and clutched in her hand. It was a detail investigators at the time knew was significant, but they lacked modern tools. In the 1990s, the evidence was re-examined. Schrader's pubic hair sample taken in 1962 was compared microscopically to the hairs found on Carol. The conclusion: Schrader's hairs were consistent with the crime scene hairs, and more importantly, 141 other hair donors were excluded. Schrader was not. In forensic terms, especially in a pre-DNA era, this was massive. But investigators wanted more. They wanted the clarity that only DNA could provide. In the autumn of the year 2024, the hair evidence was submitted to a Texas laboratory for state-of-the-art testing through a research partnership funded by grants. There was hope, but also fear. The evidence had been kept in an attic, unprotected from Pennsylvania's humid summers and freezing winters for decades. It had already failed DNA testing in the 1990s. When the results finally came in, investigators felt both grief and vindication. The DNA had degraded too far. A modern profile could not be developed. The scientific door was closed, but the circumstantial door remained wide open. The absence of DNA did not weaken the case. It simply meant the truth would have to be reconstructed without it through motive, opportunity, confession, behavior, forensics, and historical evidence. And every one of those paths led back to the same man. After the murder of 9-year-old Carol Anne Dougherty, the town of Bristol mourned. Families locked doors for the first time. Children stayed closer to home. Parents escorted their kids to school. The little church where Carol was last seen, once a symbol of sanctuary, became a place of fear and whispered speculation. But while Bristol grieved, William Shrader moved on. Not with remorse, not with fear, but with the cold instincts of a man who had evaded the law his entire life. Shrader left Pennsylvania quietly in the mid-1960s. To anyone looking at his departure, it might have seemed unremarkable, a drifter moving from place to place, which he had done for most of his life. But to investigators who later pieced together the timeline, Shrader's sudden relocation looked like something else entirely. A calculated escape. He traveled first to Florida, blending into the pockets of transient communities where no one asked questions. Then he pushed west to Louisiana, drifting through small towns and rural parishes where people often knew their neighbors only by first name. And everywhere he went, violence followed. Shrader stole cars. He threatened people. He harassed women and fought men. He was arrested multiple times under aliases. He drifted in and out of jails like it was a revolving door. Authorities would later describe his movements as the footprints of a man constantly running not from the law, but from accountability. In the years following Carol's murder, Shrader built a new life in Terrebonne Parish. He married. He became a stepfather. He lived in a neighborhood where few people knew who he really was. To his neighbors, he appeared rough around the edges, but unremarkable. The kind of man who made people uncomfortable, but didn't raise immediate alarm. Only in hindsight did the community realize they had been living beside a predator. The environment inside Shrader's Louisiana home was one of silence, manipulation, and terror. For the children who lived under his roof, the world outside was safer than the world within. When investigators later interviewed surviving family members, they described Shrader's presence as oppressive, unpredictable, and deeply disturbing. His rage could ignite without warning, and his violence, both physical and psychological, filled every corner of the home. The 2 daughters he inherited through marriage were particularly vulnerable. Both were living with developmental challenges and relied heavily on the adults in their lives to recognize danger. Shrader exploited that vulnerability. He preyed on their innocence. He controlled their movements. He threatened them into silence. His behavior followed a pattern seen in dangerous offenders worldwide. Isolate the victims. Create dependency. Intimidate through unpredictable violence. Normalize the abuse until silence becomes survival. Shrader's wife, overwhelmed and isolated herself, struggled to understand the full scope of what was happening. Abusers like Shrader rarely show their true faces to everyone in the home. They divide their household emotionally, ensuring no one has the complete picture. It was only years later, after the household collapsed, that the truth about Shrader's abuse spilled out in full. And it was far more horrific than anyone had imagined. Not only had he abused his stepdaughters, but he also fathered a child through the younger one, turning the household into a maze of secrecy and trauma. But even as Shrader terrorized those closest to him, his violence did not stop there. He targeted the adopted toddler. He targeted the 12-year-old foster child, Catherine Smith. He targeted any child who entered the home and could be overpowered. His predatory behavior extended across years, across states, across innocent lives. The question investigators would later ask themselves was chilling. If this is what Shrader did in Louisiana, what was he capable of in Pennsylvania years earlier? The answer, slowly emerging through decades, became impossible to ignore. The fire that consumed the Shrader home on Halloween night, 1970, became a defining moment in the unraveling of Shrader's life. It began with an argument, a heated, violent confrontation between Shrader and his wife that escalated until her adult son stepped in, physically forcing Shrader out of the house. Shrader's final words as he left were burned into the memories of those who heard them. "I'm coming back, and I'm going to burn the house down and kill everyone inside it." Hours later, flames erupted from the home. Inside were 3 children, Shrader's biological daughter, the 2-year-old adopted child, and 12-year-old Catherine Smith. Smoke filled the rooms. The fire spread rapidly. Adults fled to safety, screaming for the children to escape. But inside one of the bedrooms, Catherine made a choice that would define her legacy. She shielded the toddler with her own body. She curled around the little girl, using herself as a barrier against the flames. By the time firefighters reached them, Catherine had succumbed to the smoke and heat. The toddler survived because Catherine, a child herself, chose sacrifice over fear. Her death sent shockwaves through the community. Neighbors whispered about Shrader's earlier threats. Some suspected arson. Others feared retaliation. But Louisiana, like many states at the time, often struggled to gather evidence in domestic or child endangerment cases. The truth of Shrader's involvement in the fire took years to emerge. When it finally did, through family members breaking their silence, Shrader was arrested and charged. In 1985, 15 years after Catherine's death, he was convicted of arson and manslaughter. He was sentenced to 21 years in prison, and that sentence would carry him into his final years. Shrader died behind bars in the year 2002, but even in death, he could not escape the truth, because investigators had unfinished business, and Carol Anne's case had not been forgotten. And Maydu, it is listens everybody. In November of the year 2024, investigators in Bristol received a message from Louisiana authorities that would change the course of the case forever. A man had come forward, a man who had lived in Shrader's house, a man Shrader once tried to influence, intimidate, and control. His stepson, Robert LeBlanc. Robert had been carrying a secret for decades. Shrader, he said, had confessed to him twice that he had raped and killed a little girl in Pennsylvania many years earlier. Robert remembered Shrader describing a church, a girl he lured inside, the assault, the fear that she would tell Bed, and the decision to silence her permanently. Robert had tried to report this once in 1994 and again in 2007. But the information never reached Pennsylvania. It sat, buried in Louisiana records, untouched. Now, after 60 years, the truth finally surfaced. When Pennsylvania investigators interviewed Robert in person, they found him credible, sincere, and detailed. He did not dramatize his account. He spoke plainly, haunted by what he had carried all these years. He did not seek money. He did not seek fame. He wanted honesty and justice and closure for a little girl whose name he had never known until that moment. For investigators, Robert's testimony was not just a confession, it was the missing link in Shrader's psychological profile. Perpetrators sometimes confess only once in their lives, usually to someone they believe will never reveal it. Robert had been that person. And now, the truth was free. For 6 decades, Carol Anne Dougherty's case lived in the quiet corners of filing cabinets, old storage rooms, and the memories of those who had worked it. As years passed, evidence was boxed, shelved, and eventually moved into the attic of the Bristol Borough Municipal Building, a warm, dusty space never intended to house critical forensic material. Extreme Pennsylvania summers baked the boxes. Winters froze them. Moisture crept into envelopes. Labels faded. Fibers loosened. Yet somehow, the most important pieces survived. Inside that attic sat the tiny, fragile hairs clutched in Carol's hand the day she was found. They were irreplaceable. They were irrefutable. And although time had destroyed the DNA within them, what remained became a critical piece of the puzzle the grand jury would later rely on. The forensic reinvestigation in the early 1990s compared those hairs with samples voluntarily provided by potential suspects, samples collected decades earlier. Out of 141 samples submitted, all suspects except one were excluded. Only William Shrader's hairs were consistent with the crime scene hairs. This did not prove guilt the way DNA might today, but it built the foundation for something equally powerful. Exclusion. No priest. No handyman. No local boy with scratches on his face. Not a single community member who had once been suspected. Only one man could not be eliminated. A man who lived 1 block from the church. A man with a lifelong pattern of predatory violence. A man who fled Pennsylvania after the murder. A man who confessed the crime to his own stepson. A man whose hair matched the only biological evidence recovered from the victim. Even without modern DNA testing, the evidence was converging. The picture was sharpening. The past was speaking. That donest and the donest, that donest. When the Bucks County investigating grand jury convened in the autumn of the year 2025, they were handed more than just a cold case. They were handed a story about a little girl whose life ended in a sacred space, a church vestibule where trust should have been absolute. The grand jury was tasked with reviewing every scrap of evidence. Forensic hair comparisons. Shrader's violent history. His pattern of behavior from childhood onward. His failed and passed polygraphs. His movements after the murder. The stepson's 2 confessions. Expert testimony on sexual predator behavior. Past investigative missteps. The impossibility of DNA recovery. What they found was not a case lacking evidence, but a case suffering from the limitations of its era. Modern technology, if available in 1962, might have solved the case in days, but forensic science then was rudimentary. Sexual crimes were poorly understood, child victimization patterns were not yet studied, and interstate information sharing was virtually non-existent. Still, when the grand jury reconstructed the timeline, motives, behaviors, and witness accounts, the narrative was unmistakable. They unanimously concluded, William Shrader raped and murdered 9-year-old Carol Anne Dougherty inside St. Mark's Catholic Church on October 22, 1962. He acted alone. He targeted her opportunistically. He killed her to avoid detection. And he fled Pennsylvania shortly afterward. The case was formally declared solved, and after 60-plus years of waiting, the Dougherty family finally had the truth. Any since screb. When the grand jury findings were announced publicly on October 29th of the year 2025, only one member of Carol Anne's immediate family remained alive. Her younger sister, Kay. Kay had been 2 years old when Carol was murdered. She grew up without memories of her sister's laughter, her voice, her habits, her personality. Instead, she grew up with the memory of a single moment. The sound her father made when he returned home after finding Carol's body. A guttural cry of anguish so primal, so raw, that it carved itself into her earliest consciousness. A sound she said she could never forget. At the press conference, Kay stood beside investigators, her presence a living reminder of the family forever changed on that October afternoon. In a soft, steady voice, she shared a statement. Though nothing can bring Carol back, we can finally let her rest in peace, knowing that her story has been told, her truth revealed, and her memory honored. Her words were not dramatic. They were not theatrical. They were not meant for headlines. They were spoken the way her sister had lived, quietly, honestly, with the gentle dignity of a family that had endured more than most will ever know. The case had taken everything from the Doughertys, Carol's life, Dorothy's emotional stability, Frank's peace, and the childhood innocence of an entire community. Solving it did not undo any of that, but it closed the wound that had been open for 63 years. Any since screb. Bristol, Pennsylvania, is not a large place. It is the kind of town where families attend the same church for generations, where neighbors watch out for one another, where children bike freely down familiar sidewalks. Carol Anne's murder changed that for an entire generation. In the early 1960s, locking one's doors was rare. Parents didn't imagine predators living a block away. Children walked to school in small groups. Churches were sanctuaries. The night Carol was killed, that illusion shattered. Many Bristol residents locked their doors that night for the very first time. Some walked their children to school afterward. Others refused to let their kids attend choir practice unless they were personally escorted. Decades later, older residents still remembered that shift. They remembered where they were when they heard the news. They remembered the fear that settled in the sense that innocence had been stolen not just from the Dougherty family, but from the community itself. When the case was finally solved in 2025, Bristol reacted with somber relief. The town had lived with the mystery for a lifetime. Churches had changed leadership. Neighborhoods had transformed. Generations had grown up unaware of the shadow that once loomed over their streets. But the residents who were children in 1962 remembered, And for them, the grand jury's announcement brought the closure they never thought they would see. This vorted. Though many investigators worked on the Dougherty case over the decades, one name remained synonymous with the pursuit of justice: Chief Vincent Faragalli. Faragalli had been the heart of the investigation. He refused to close the case, refused to let it be forgotten, refused to allow politics, church leadership, or public pressure to prevent him from doing what he believed was right. He kept Carol Anne's photograph on his desk every day until he retired in 1979. When he passed away in January of the year 2001 at the age of 81, the photograph moved with him to his home, where it remained a silent reminder of a promise unfulfilled. Faragalli did not live to see the case solved, but his persistence laid the groundwork for the grand jury's final determination. Similarly, generations of police officers, detectives, district attorneys, and forensic analysts contributed pieces of the puzzle. Each carried the torch a little farther, ensuring the case was never buried completely beneath time. Their determination, spanning 63 years, became part of the fabric of this story, a reminder that justice delayed is not always justice denied. On October 29th of the year 2025, Bucks County District Attorney Jennifer Shorn stepped before cameras, microphones, and a room filled with reporters, investigators, and community members. Behind her were the grand jury findings. In front of her was the weight of 63 years. Her announcement was clear, firm, and direct. The grand jury has unanimously concluded that William Shrader committed the rape and murder of 9-year-old Carol Anne Dougherty on October 22, 1962. It was the sentence the Dougherty family had needed for a lifetime. It was the truth investigators had suspected for decades. It was the closure that had eluded an entire community. Although Shrader died in the year 2002 and could not stand trial, the district attorney emphasized that the investigation had reached what she called a definitive conclusion. The case was officially solved. No more speculation. No more shadows. No more unanswered questions. Just truth. For a murder committed in a silent church vestibule more than half a century earlier, truth was the one thing no one had dared hope for anymore. The room was quiet as she read from the report, detailing Shrader's history of violence, the failed and past polygraphs, the forensic hair analysis, his confession to his stepson, his presence near the church at the time of the murder plan, his disappearance from Pennsylvania shortly afterward, his long-standing pattern of predatory behavior. Every piece fit. Every path led to him. Every angle of the case converged on the same inevitable conclusion. For the Dougherty family, this was not triumph. It was closure wrapped in sorrow. But closure, nonetheless, was today. To understand the final determination, one must understand the man behind the crime. Shrader's life, when mapped chronologically, formed a chilling pattern. Childhood. A boy who hurt others even as early as 8 years old. A boy who struck a young girl in the face with a club. A boy who was in and out of reform school. This was not mischief. It was the origin of a lifelong pattern. Teens. A troubled youth who joined the army at 17. A young man discharged dishonorably within a year. A man who shot at another man, leading to a conviction for attempted murder. He escalated quickly and violently. 20s. Released from Eastern State Penitentiary and relocated to Bristol. Lived only a block from St. Mark's Catholic Church. Matched witness descriptions on the day of the murder. Lied repeatedly about his whereabouts. Provided a hair sample consistent with crime scene hairs. He was geographically close, psychologically primed, and situationally opportunistic. 30s and 40s. Moved to Florida. Then Louisiana. Married into a vulnerable household. Began abusing stepchildren. Fathered a child through sexual abuse. Targeted foster children. Destroyed the life of a 12-year-old girl who died protecting a toddler. 50s. Convicted of arson and manslaughter. In prison, continued to show no remorse. 60s. Died in custody. Carrying secrets he believed would die with him. But secrets have a way of surfacing, especially when they are spoken aloud. Even once. His confession to Robert LeBlanc became the quiet detonator that reopened the case 60 years later. Shrader was not a man who lost control. He was a man who lived without it. A serial predator whose first known murder was Carol Anne Dougherty. The grand jury's conclusion did not stretch logic. It followed the trail of his life. Was today in Shands. Bristol had changed since the 1960s. New families had moved in, old families had moved away. Businesses had come and gone. Children now walked the same sidewalks Carol once rode her bicycle across, unaware that the streets had once felt very different. But for those who had lived through that time, the memories were carved into their hearts. Carol's murder had been the moment innocence shattered. The moment doors locked. The moment parents stopped letting children wander freely. When the grand jury report was released, many older residents felt a sense of grief resurface. Some cried, others prayed. Some reached out to long-retired officers to thank them for never giving up. One elderly resident told a reporter, "For 60 years, whenever I walked past that church, I thought of that little girl. Today, I can finally breathe." The past had not been erased, but it had been answered. One is the bidit. Presented in a respectful, ads-friendly, non-graphic way. Carol Anne was last seen riding her bicycle past Street Mark's Catholic Church around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Her plan was simple: return 2 library books, borrow the next novel in her mystery series, buy a soda and candy at Tommy's Market, and be home in time for dinner at 4:45. She never made it. Based on the grand jury's conclusions and the investigation accumulated over decades, this is the most supported reconstruction of her final moments. Carol Anne, influenced by the nun's encouragement to say a small prayer when passing the church, likely stopped at street marks for a moment of quiet devotion. She parked her bicycle neatly outside. Inside the vestibule, a man lurked in the shadows. A man who knew the church layout. A man who lived a block away. A man with a long history of violence toward children. He saw opportunity. He saw isolation. He saw a trusting 9-year-old child walking into a space where she believed she was safe. What happened next was quick, chaotic, and tragically irreversible. In those silent moments inside the church, Carol Anne encountered the one person who should never have been near her. A man who would later confess he had to keep her from talking. A man who would go on to terrorize children for decades. A man who escaped justice for 63 years. Yes. When the district attorney's office closed the case, they emphasized an essential truth. Justice can be delayed. Justice can be obstructed. Justice can be complicated by time. But justice can still arrive. Carol Anne's parents did not live to see the day her case was solved. Chief Faragalli did not live to see it either. Many witnesses, clergy members, investigators, and early suspects had passed away long before the truth was revealed. But their efforts were not wasted. Their determination was not forgotten. Their commitment laid the foundation for the final verdict. As Kay Dougherty stood before the cameras in 2025, she represented not just her family, but an entire generation of Bristol residents who had waited for the truth. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke the words that would close the chapter forever. We can finally let Carol rest. Cold cases are not only puzzles, they are wounds. They linger in silence, waiting for answers that may never come, carried by the hearts of those who cannot forget. For decades, Carol Anne Dougherty existed mostly in memories. A photograph in a frame. A bicycle parked outside street marks. A little girl who loved mysteries, yet became one herself. A tragedy that reshaped a community. A name that lived on in police files, in investigators' minds, in the quiet grief of a family that had already lost too much. Her case became a symbol not only of unimaginable loss, but also of relentless pursuit. The pursuit of truth across generations, across changing forensic science, across fading memories. Even after 60 years, investigators believed Carol deserved the same determination given to cases solved within days. Her parents deserved it. Her sister deserved it. Bristol deserved it. And in the end, persistence won. Mason. Friend. Closure is not celebration. It is not victory. It is acceptance. For Carol's sister Kay, the closure came with both relief and sadness. She never truly knew her older sister, only the imprint she left behind. She grew up hearing Carol described as kind, thoughtful, imaginative, and gentle. The sort of child who saw beauty in books, mystery stories, and the simple comfort of riding her bicycle. Kay's statement during the press conference captured a truth that investigators, journalists, and community members all felt. Though nothing can bring Carol back, we can finally let her rest in peace. Closure was not about triumph over evil. It was about restoring dignity to a child who had been taken so violently and so early. It was about giving the Dougherty family an answer to the question that had haunted them for years. Why? Why her? Why there? Why that day? The answer was brutally simple. Because she was alone. Because she was vulnerable. Because a predator happened to be waiting. But most importantly, because justice, no matter how delayed, still arrived. Mason. Friend. Cold cases teach us that time can hide evidence, bury memories, and distort recollections, but they also teach us that truth leaves footprints. Even when evidence deteriorates, witnesses pass away, suspects flee, systems fail, and entire decades disappear. Truth has a way of resurfacing. From the hair evidence, to the witness sighting of the man with the scar, to the pattern of predatory violence, to the failed polygraphs, to the confession Shrader believed would never be repeated, to the grand jury that finally saw the full picture. Each piece alone was not enough. Together, they told the story. A story that spanned 63 years. A story of a child whose life was cut short. A story of investigators who refused to let her fade. A story of a family who suffered through silence. A story that now finally has an ending. Every 4. Carol Anne Dougherty was 9 years old when she was taken. 9 years old when she became the center of a case that would last a lifetime. 9 years old when she unknowingly became a symbol of perseverance, teamwork, and justice, delayed but not denied. Today, her story is remembered not only for the tragedy that happened to her, but for the resilience of everyone who fought to bring light to what was once a dark, unanswered mystery. Parents still remind their children of her gentle nature. Older residents still speak of her with tenderness. Investigators still mention her name with a quiet respect. And Kay, the little sister who was too young to remember, her carries the final word. Her memory is honored. And that is the legacy Carol leaves behind. Is dud. The criminal schema outro. Ads friendly, concise, natural for narration. If you've made it this far in the story, thank you for spending time with us as we revisited one of Pennsylvania's most haunting cold cases. These stories matter because the people behind them mattered. Before you go, take a moment to like this video, drop a comment with your thoughts, and hit the subscribe button so you never miss the next deep dive from the criminal schema. Every engagement helps this channel continue bringing you detailed, respectful, and investigative true crime documentaries. Thank you for watching, and as always, stay safe, stay curious, and stay aware.